I was folding laundry in the bedroom when I heard the front door open. Not knocked on, opened with the particular ease of someone who already had a key and had used it before I could get downstairs. By the time I reached the top of the staircase, there were 4 men standing in my living room. Large men, deliberately so, the kind whose presence alone is meant to communicate something before a single word gets spoken. My husband stood slightly behind them, arms crossed, jaw set in an expression I'd never once seen him wear in 6 years of marriage. "Sit down," he said to me, not looking at me directly. "We're going to have an honest conversation tonight." Finally, I stayed exactly where I was, halfway down the staircase, one hand resting lightly on the railing. "About what exactly?" "About who you've been meeting," he said, his voice rising slightly, unsteady in the way voices get when someone spent weeks rehearsing a confrontation in their head, and it still doesn't come out the way they'd planned. "The late nights. The locked phone. The calls you take in the garage with the door shut. I want the truth, and if you won't give it to me honestly, maybe you'll give it to me in front of people who don't care about being polite." I looked at the 4 men standing in my living room, positioned with the kind of deliberate spacing that suggested my husband had, at minimum, watched enough movies to think this looked intimidating. I felt something in me go very calm. Not frightened. Calm, the specific practice calm of someone who has spent nearly 2 decades learning exactly how dangerous rooms actually announce themselves, and recognizing immediately that this wasn't one of them. Not for me anyway. "You brought men into our home," I said quietly, "to scare a confession out of me." "I brought men into our home," he said, "because you leave me no choice. Because 6 years of marriage, and I still don't know who my own wife really is." I almost laughed. Not from amusement. From the sheer staggering irony of that sentence, spoken by a man about to learn, in the next 4 minutes, exactly how right he was, and exactly how wrong he was about what it meant. I finished walking down the stairs. I want you to understand something about the version of me standing on those steps that night. The woman folding laundry 20 minutes earlier and the woman now descending toward 4 strange men in her living room were, in fact, the exact same person I'd always been. My husband simply hadn't spent 6 years asking the right questions. I stepped into the living room, and I watched the first man's face change. Not confusion. Recognition. He went pale first, then his posture shifted entirely, shoulders dropping from their deliberate, intimidating stance into something closer to a soldier suddenly realizing who he's been ordered to stand in front of. He said something quietly to the man beside him, too low for my husband to catch, but I caught every word. "That's her. That's the boss." My husband turned to look at him, confused, still holding on to the shape of the confrontation he'd planned. "What are you talking about? I hired you to scare my wife into telling the truth." The man who'd spoken looked at my husband with an expression somewhere between disbelief and something close to pity. "Sir," he said slowly, "your wife doesn't answer to people like us. We answer to her." I had no idea, folding laundry 20 minutes earlier, that my husband's fragile paranoia was about to collide, in our own living room, with a truth he'd spent 6 years married to without ever once suspecting it existed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. I didn't grow up believing I would someday run anything at all, let alone an organization worth the kind of number people whisper about when they think I can't hear them. My grandfather built what eventually became Callaway Holdings out of a modest shipping and logistics operation in the years after the war, the kind of unglamorous essential infrastructure business that quietly moves goods, contracts, and over decades enormous amounts of leverage through ports, warehouses, and relationships most people never think about. By the time I was born, it had grown into something far larger and far more complicated than shipping crates from one coast to another. A private network of holdings spanning logistics, security contracting, and financial services worth, by the most recent valuation I'd seen, somewhere north of $800 million. I want to be careful here because I know what the word empire conjures for most people, especially given how this story's been framed. This was never, at its core, some cinematic underworld operation. It was, and still is, a legitimate, if fiercely private business empire. One that happened to operate in industries where power, secrecy, and protection matter as much as balance sheets. My grandfather understood something early on that shaped everything that came after: visibility is a liability. The less the world knew about who actually controlled Callaway Holdings, the safer that control remained. I didn't understand any of this as a child. I understood instead that my grandfather took an unusual interest in my education, insisting gently but firmly that I study finance, then later negotiation and organizational psychology, framed always as just useful things for a smart young woman to know, never as preparation for anything specific. I understood, looking back now with the clarity only distance provides, that I was being shaped for something long before I was told what that something actually was. I learned to read a room the way most people learn to read a book. I learned by 17 how to sit in a business meeting and say nothing for an hour, simply observing who deferred to whom, who postured, who actually held the leverage in a room dressed up to look otherwise. My grandfather told me the truth finally the week I turned 22, not as a dramatic revelation but calmly over dinner, the way you might tell someone about a family property they were about to inherit. He explained the scope of what Callaway Holdings actually was. He explained the specific, careful protocols that had kept our family's control of it quiet for 3 generations, the deliberate cultivation of ordinary lives, ordinary names, ordinary public personas, layered protectively over an organization that could not survive the kind of scrutiny visibility would invite. I didn't take over immediately. My grandfather lived another 11 years after that dinner, mentoring me slowly, deliberately, through every layer of the organization, the legitimate holding companies, the security divisions, the network of relationships that kept everything functioning quietly and, when necessary, kept threats to that quiet functioning firmly at bay. I learned to run board meetings. I learned to run rooms where board meetings weren't nearly enough. By the time he passed, 6 years before the night my husband invited 4 men into our living room, I had already been running significant portions of the organization for years, under his supervision, learning the specific weight of decisions that affected thousands of employees and, at times, decisions considerably heavier than that. To the outside world, and to nearly everyone in my daily life, I was simply Sarah, a woman who ran a consulting firm, attended PTA-adjacent charity functions, drove an unremarkable car, and lived in an unremarkable, if comfortable, suburban house. This wasn't an accident or a disguise I put on reluctantly. It was, by design, exactly the kind of ordinary life my grandfather had spent decades teaching me to protect, because ordinary lives don't attract the kind of attention that endangers everything built beneath them. I met my husband during this ordinary chapter, 5 years into running the organization in earnest. He knew Sarah, competent, a little guarded, occasionally away on business trips she didn't discuss in detail. He never knew Callaway Holdings existed. He never knew the woman across the dinner table from him most nights held more actual power than most of the men he admired in the business news he read every morning. I chose not to tell him. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters to understanding what came later. It wasn't distrust, not entirely, not at first. It was protection for him as much as for myself. The fewer people who knew the truth, the safer everyone connected to me remained, including a husband who had no idea the boring wife he'd married was quietly responsible for decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars, made in rooms he never once suspected existed. For the first 3 years of our marriage, this arrangement worked more or less. I was careful, disciplined, present enough at home that the absences didn't accumulate into obvious patterns. But organizations like mine don't stay quiet on their own schedule. Crises emerge, negotiations require travel, security concerns demand attention at hours that can't be explained away as ordinary work. By year 4, the absences had grown harder to manage gracefully. By year 5, I watched my husband's quiet, reasonable questions calcify slowly into something else entirely, not questions born from genuine curiosity, but questions born from an insecurity I hadn't fully appreciated the depth of, an insecurity that would, eventually, convince him of an infidelity that had never once existed, and lead him to a decision that would end up revealing far more about the world he'd been living beside, unknowingly, for 6 years. I want to be fair to my husband in telling this part, even knowing how the story ends, because I don't think what happened to him is entirely unfamiliar to a lot of marriages, even ones without a hidden business empire sitting underneath them. Insecurity rarely announces itself as insecurity. It usually arrives dressed as vigilance, as diligence, as a reasonable person simply paying close attention to reasonable things. It started, as far as I can trace it, with a canceled anniversary dinner 18 months before the men showed up in our living room. I'd received an urgent call, a genuine crisis, A security breach at one of our shipping terminals that required my direct involvement that same night, and I'd left the house in the middle of getting ready, apologizing as sincerely as I could without explaining anything real. He forgave that one easily enough. It was the 5th or 6th version of that same scene, spread out over the following year, that started to wear a different groove into him. I understand now, piecing it together afterward, what those months looked like from where he was standing. A wife who traveled with increasing frequency, for a consulting firm whose actual clients he could never quite name when friends asked. A phone that stayed locked always, even at home, even during ordinary evenings, a habit I'd maintained since I was 22, for reasons that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with security protocols he knew nothing about. Calls taken in the garage, door shut, voice low, conversations about security incidents, personnel decisions, negotiations worth more than our house, conducted in hushed tones because some of what I discussed could genuinely endanger people if overheard by the wrong ears, including his. I can see now how those details might assemble themselves into an entirely different story in the mind of someone who didn't have the real one available to them. He mentioned it first gently almost a year before that night. "You know you can tell me anything," he said one evening, apropos of very little, in the specific tone people use when they're fishing for a confession they've already half convinced themselves exists. I told him honestly that nothing was wrong, that work had simply been demanding lately. I meant it. It just wasn't the whole truth, and I understand now how incomplete truths, repeated often enough, can curdle into something that feels like deception, even when the intent behind them is protective rather than deceitful. By month 10 he'd stopped asking gently. I found him once, scrolling through my phone's call log on the lock screen, trying and failing to make sense of numbers he didn't recognize, names logged only as initials for security reasons he couldn't have understood. I found a receipt once in his jacket pocket by accident, for a private investigator's consultation fee, a lead he apparently never followed through on, whether from cost or from some lingering hope that he was wrong. I think, if I'm honest, his friends made it worse in the well-meaning, damaging way friends sometimes do. I overheard him once on the phone with his college roommate, describing my absences in language that had clearly been reframed and validated by someone else's suspicion. "She's hiding something, man. 6 years and I still don't really know her." His friend, from what I could hear of the other half of that conversation, didn't discourage the theory. If anything, he fed it, offering the kind of confident, second-hand certainty men sometimes provide each other about women they've never actually met. By the final months before that night, my husband had built, in his own mind, an entire narrative, complete with an imagined affair, an imagined betrayal, 6 years of marriage recast entirely as a slow, deliberate deception. I understand why, even now. I simply wish, more than almost anything else in this story, that he'd asked me directly one more time, before deciding that 4 hired men might get him an answer conversation hadn't. He found the men through a coworker's cousin, someone with a loose connection to people who handle things quietly. The kind of arrangement made over a few nervous, half-ashamed phone calls, paid for in cash, organized without any real understanding of who he was actually hiring or what world that kind of hiring sometimes brushed up against. I didn't know any of this was happening. I was, that same week, deep in negotiations over a genuinely difficult security matter at one of our Western logistics hubs. Ironically, precisely the kind of demanding, secretive work that had fed his suspicion in the first place. I came home that night tired, distracted, thinking only about laundry and an early morning call, with absolutely no idea that my husband had spent the day arranging exactly the kind of confrontation that was about to collide, catastrophically for him, with exactly who I actually was. You already know how the evening began. The door opening before I could reach it, for men arranged deliberately in my living room, my husband's voice rising into a register I'd never heard him use with me before. I want to walk you through what happened after I finished descending those stairs, because the 4 minutes that followed reshaped everything about our marriage far more thoroughly than any confession ever could have. I stepped fully into the living room. I remember the specific quality of the silence that followed. Not the silence of people waiting for me to speak, but the silence of men recalculating in real time exactly whose house they were standing in. The first man to recognize me was older, graying at the temples, the kind of quiet, seasoned presence that told me immediately he'd been doing this kind of work for a long time. His eyes moved to my face, then to something just behind my ear, a small, deliberate scar I'd carried since a security incident 8 years earlier, One that appeared in exactly one classified internal document most of my organization's senior security personnel had at some point been shown, purely for identification purposes. I watched him place it. I watched the exact moment his posture shifted from performative intimidation into something closer to genuine alarm. He said something quietly to the man beside him, the words my husband couldn't quite catch, though I heard every syllable clearly. That's her. That's the boss. The second man's reaction came almost instantly after, his eyes widening as he made the same connection, his hand actually moving away from where it had been resting near his jacket, as though putting distance between himself and whatever he'd been prepared to do only moments earlier. My husband, still holding on to the shape of the confrontation he'd rehearsed, looked between the men and me with visible confusion. What are you talking about? I hired you to scare my wife into telling the truth. Sir, the older man said slowly, I think you should sit down. I don't need to sit down, I need answers. Your wife, the man said, his voice carrying the specific careful weight of someone choosing every word deliberately, isn't someone you hire people to scare. She's someone people like us report to. Directly. Has been for years. I watched my husband's face cycle through several expressions in rapid succession, confusion, disbelief, something that might have been the beginning of fear, though not fear of me exactly. Fear of the sudden, vertiginous sense that the floor of his own understanding had disappeared beneath him without warning. Stand down, I said quietly to the four men, and I watched all four of them respond instantly, shifting from confrontation into something closer to attention, the posture of people accustomed to taking direction the moment it's given. Nothing happens in this house tonight. Understood. Understood, ma'am, the older man said. The other three echoed some version of the same, quieter, clearly relieved to be given an exit from a situation they'd only now understood the actual danger of. I asked the men to wait outside. Once the door closed behind them, my husband stood in the middle of our living room, looking at me the way you look at someone you're meeting for the first time despite having shared a bed with them for 6 years. Who are you? He asked, and I understood, hearing the specific rawness in his voice, that he wasn't asking about an affair anymore. He was asking something far larger than that. I told him, not everything, some things even now remain too sensitive to explain fully to someone outside the organization's inner circle, even a husband. But I told him enough. The truth about Callaway Holdings, about my grandfather, about the $800 million in holdings he'd shared a home with for 6 years without once suspecting existed, about the specific, deliberate reasons I'd built an ordinary life around a far less ordinary truth. He sat down slowly on the arm of our couch, absorbing it the way you absorb news that reorganizes an entire decade of assumptions in real time. I brought men into our house, he said quietly, mostly to himself, to intimidate the most powerful person I've ever known in my life. Yes, I said. You did. Neither of us slept much that night. We sat in the living room until nearly 4 in the morning, the same room those four men had stood in only hours earlier, working through 6 years of marriage that suddenly required an entirely different set of explanations than either of us had expected to give. I answered what I could. I told him about the years with my grandfather, about the specific discipline required to run something that size quietly, about the genuine danger that came with visibility in an organization like mine, danger not just to me, but to anyone connected closely enough to be used as leverage against me. I explained, as gently as I could, that keeping him outside the truth had never been about distrust of him specifically. It had been about a protocol built over 3 generations, designed to protect exactly the kind of ordinary domestic life we'd built together. I want to be fair to him here, because I think the version of this story that simply paints him as a fool misses something more honest and more useful. He wasn't a bad man. He was a frightened one, who let that fear metastasize over months, into a decision he clearly regretted the instant those men recognized me. I should have just asked you again, he said, somewhere around 2 in the morning, his voice hollowed out with exhaustion and something close to shame. Instead of listening to Danny, instead of hiring strangers to do what I was too scared to just ask you myself. Yes, I said. You should have. I didn't say it cruelly. I said it because it was true, and because I think he needed to hear it stated plainly rather than softened into something easier to carry. The harder conversation came the following week, once the shock had settled into something more like grief for both of us. Because the truth neither of us wanted to say out loud, that first long night, was this: even setting aside the men, even setting aside the specific catastrophic misjudgment of hiring strangers to intimidate his own wife, the paranoia itself had revealed something real about the state of our marriage. 6 years in, and he'd been capable of believing fully, completely, that I was capable of betraying him in exactly the way he feared. Not because of anything I'd actually done. Because the distance my secrecy had created, however necessary, had left room for exactly that kind of fear to grow unchecked. I sat with that honestly in the weeks that followed. I asked myself questions I hadn't allowed myself to ask before, whether the protective distance I'd maintained for so long, for reasons that made perfect sense on paper, had quietly cost us something in practice that no amount of explanation could fully repair after the fact. There were, naturally, internal consequences within Callaway Holdings once word of the incident reached my senior staff, not punitive toward my husband, but protective toward the organization. My head of security conducted a quiet review of exactly how someone with only a loose, second-hand connection had managed to locate and hire personnel with any tie to our security division at all, a gap that was identified and closed within weeks. I want to be clear that nothing violent occurred that night or afterward. The men my husband hired stood down the instant they recognized me, and the matter was handled through internal protocol rather than retaliation of any kind. The organization's response was about closing a vulnerability, not exacting revenge. My husband and I didn't separate immediately, though I won't pretend the marriage simply returned to what it had been before that night. We spent the following months in careful, difficult conversation couples counseling, for the first time in 6 years, conducted with a therapist cleared through my security team, given the sensitivity of what we needed to discuss honestly in that room. I don't know even now exactly where that work will ultimately lead us. What I do know is this: the truth, once it finally entered our marriage, couldn't simply be folded back into the careful protective silence I'd maintained for 6 years. Some doors, once open, don't close again the same way. It's been a little over a year now since that night. I want to give you an honest answer about where things stand, rather than the tidy one you might be expecting. My husband and I are still married. I won't pretend the road there was simple, or that a single conversation, however long, undid the damage of what he did or the years of necessary distance that led him there. We spent the better part of 10 months in genuine difficult work, therapy, yes, but also the slower, less glamorous work of him learning to sit with uncertainty instead of filling it with the worst possible story, and me learning to let him further into a life I'd spent 2 decades instinctively protecting from everyone. I made changes on my end too because I think fairness requires acknowledging that. I brought him carefully and gradually into a version of the truth appropriate for a spouse, not operational details, not the specific security protocols that still need to remain protected, but enough of the real shape of my life that he no longer has to fill in the blanks with fear. He knows now when I'm traveling for a genuine crisis versus routine business. He has a way to reach me through my security team that doesn't require him wondering for 6 hours whether something's wrong. The 4 men from that night remain, to this day, part of my organization's security division. I made a point in the weeks that followed of speaking with each of them individually, not to punish them for the position they'd been placed in, since none of them had any real understanding of who they'd been hired to confront, but to understand exactly how a coworker's cousin's loose connection had reached that deep into my own security network in the first place. That gap is closed now. I made certain of it personally. I've thought often, over this past year, about what it actually meant that 4 strangers recognized the true shape of my power before my own husband did. I don't say that with bitterness anymore, though I won't pretend it didn't sting in those early weeks, to sit with that particular irony. What I've come to believe instead is this: the secrecy I maintained for so long, the ordinary life I built so carefully around an extraordinary truth, was never meant to be permanent architecture. It was meant to be scaffolding, protective, necessary, but never intended to be the final shape of an actual marriage, an actual partnership built on something more honest than careful management. If you've ever built walls around parts of yourself for protection, for safety, for reasons that made complete sense at the time, I want you to hear something I learned the hard way in my own living room, surrounded by 4 men who understood who I was faster than the person who'd shared my bed for 6 years. Protecting the people you love from a truth doesn't always protect the relationship itself. Sometimes it simply protects the distance that fear needs to grow in. The truth, even the difficult, dangerous, complicated kind, is rarely as corrosive to a real partnership as the silence people build around it. however good their intentions. My husband brought 4 men into our home to teach me a lesson that night. In the end, it was the only lesson in our marriage that actually landed, just not the one either of us expected, and not the one he thought he was there to deliver.